Welcome, and what was all of that about? It's funny and wonderful how the world works. As I mentioned, Laurie's framing herself out. As I mentioned at the very beginning, well, let me start. Some of you are joining later in the morning. We started the morning with the Gata of Atonement, which is part of the Fusatsu ceremony and part of our Zen Buddhist practice. Atoning for karma that we have created. And then we went into a ceremony that, as I mentioned, in the wonderful tradition of this practice, was passed to us from Tetsugen Roshi of the Peacemakers Order in New York City, and to Tenshin Roshi, who did some modifications in writing of his own, and now to us. And that's pretty consistent with the way the Dharma is transmitted. Peacemaker's Order, Tetsugen Roshi, really committed to bearing witness, being there and bearing witness to what is so, and being one with it. Some of you know that the Peacemakers Order in practice would take people onto the streets in New York City to, with no money, and basically, and I use this deliberately because even Bernie, when he was alive, would acknowledge this. It's somewhat artificial to pretend you're homeless when you're not actually homeless, because when you go out there on the street and they spend a few days out there with no money and sleep on the streets and eat at the kitchens and that, but when you are truly not homeless, you always know that it's going to end, and you know that you have the safety net of your life as it is back there behind you. And yet still that practice of bearing witness to what is so very powerful practice and very transformative for all. I never had a chance to do that. Bernie also led groups to Germany and that part of the world, and they would sit session at some of the concentration camps and bear witness to what had happened with the Holocaust. So it's just a backdrop for the ceremony, because if you're going to bear witness to what is and what has been so and what has been created and what we take forward or not karmically, then you also need to become at one with that. And at one is a nice read of a tone. So we started the day that way, but that wasn't the original intent. When I sent out the newsletter, that wonderful picture of Nicole Kidman looking at fear for the other. And I had a couple of conversations this week with different people that really pointed to the precept of, vowing not to speak ill of others and their errors and faults, and just this sense of other. And so that inspired me. And when I put the newsletter out, that's really where I was, because look at where we are right now. We have an election coming up. Ruth Bader Ginsburg just passed away. Amy Coney Barrett, I think is the judge's name, has been nominated as her replacement. We have protesters called rioters by some. We have left and right, and even in our own midst, as we're doing our book club with this book called Zen Women, which is a really wonderful exploration of the role of powerful women and teachers throughout history in our Zen Buddhist practice. And an acknowledgement of their role, but at the same time raising a question of, well, what happened to them in the telling of the story? Where are they? And so immediately in that conversation, there's male and female, you and me, us and them, and in our discussions we have bumped up against that and rubbed up against that and rubbed up against each other. And this is it's designed to be a relatively safe place, Indra's net, right? A relatively safe place to have those discussions and practice that rubbing up against each other. And sometimes we get it right and sometimes we don't, and we continue to work on it. After book club, I fielded a series of texts and calls from various people, with various takes and questions about what had gone on. And of course, one of the things in our practice that we have not had a lot of time to practice, because these 18 people have not been in a room together a lot during a pandemic, is this notion of forthright communication from a place of clarity and love, right? Because what happens when people call me or talk to me is where does that put me right now? I have a role in this, certainly, and I'm not complaining, but we also have to develop that skill of just talking to each other, right? Of doing that rub with each other and practicing that and going, I really did not like what you had to say. It really, like that hurt, or it put me off, or I completely disagree, and learning to practice those conversations. I know in my priest training in the day in Santa Monica, we had an exercise, and I think it came out of Est or Landmark, but about getting hooked. It's a few of you may remember that exercise where we were actually paired up, and the goal was to insult each other and to see if we could hook each other. And I remember I was sitting there, I was a new priest, and someone that's not on this Zoom call was like, who are you to call yourself a priest? What makes you a priest? How can you possibly be a priest? I think you're a liar. And I got to tell you, I got hooked because it activated all my own stuff. It activated all my own doubts and questions. In cognitive behavioral therapy, that's called an ANT, automatic negative thoughts that we have about ourselves through things that we've learned or taken on over time, right? So we had this practice of not getting hooked, but the idea was that, can you confront the difficult conversation? Can you step across the line? Can you be with the other? Can you be with the other point of view and still be effective? Because for me as a new priest, that's pretty important. Because not everybody's going to agree with anything that I, in this role as teacher, now do. Nick and Luis showed up right before we started this morning to drop their dog off for a day of dog sitting. And, I'm standing there in the doorway in my robes, right? Neighbors are walking by going, wait, new neighbors walking by going, what's going on here? Nick says, it feels like I'm dropping Rim off for Sunday school. And then what do? I throw us right into the precepts, right? Here we go. Altar, robes, precepts, church, and I know in doing that Chaz or Chalet or, Charles might go, I did not sign up for this. I want to be Zen. And I'm not saying that about any of you. I'm just using names. I probably should have used generic names. But, not everybody's always going to agree. Not everybody's going to agree with that stance that we take as Zen Buddhists, that We are all inherently Buddha. We are all inherently the awakened one, and so are you, Amy Conan Barrett. So are you. And we may disagree completely with that point of view. I was teaching a class, what day was it? Thursday, Friday. Teaching a group of 42 principals in the Texas public schools districts. And my assigned teachings this time around were love and self-realization. And one of the teachings in love is, how do you love somebody that you don't love? You know, how do you respect somebody that you don't respect? And we talk about, and this is very Zen, I didn't put it in Zen terms, but we talk about circles of affiliation, right? And so with them, I was like, you know, here's my really small circle. My name is Dan. I've been a garlic farmer. I run ultra marathons, and I'm a Zen Buddhist priest. You know, that's a pretty small circle for a bunch of people from Texas, right? But then you expand that circle. You know, my name is Dan. I was born in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I graduated from J.J. Pierce High School in Richardson, Texas. You know, one of my best friends is the state painter of Texas, who is the teacher of George Bush for his instruction in painting. And I love garlic, but mostly I love to cook with garlic because I love to cook for other people. How about you? You see how that circle goes out? And all of a sudden, I've got 42 people that I don't know inside my circle of affiliation. And we've got points of contact. If there are any George Bush supporters in there, all of a sudden they're going, well, wait a minute, this is a Zen Buddhist priest, but he just brought up George Bush and had a meeting with him? Or wait a minute. So when I was teaching self-realization, right, this is Texas. There's a lot of people operating from Christian faith in Texas. I know, I've lived there, I've worked there, right? So one of my opening pitches in talking about meditation is, we all have different paths. Prayer is a wonderful form of meditation. My brother and I, who is a Christian pastor outside of Atlanta, sit and meditate together in prayer. Okay, and now all of a sudden, I've created an opportunity to connect also with somebody of even a fundamentalist point of view from a Christian faith, because you know, that doesn't always happen. When I met years ago with the deacons of my brother's church, their question was, why are you worshiping a false idol? Don't you know you're going to go to hell? When I led a memorial service in New Mexico, side by side with a Catholic priest, the sister-in-law of the woman who had passed came running up to me after the ceremony and got in my face like this and said, do you accept that Jesus Christ died for our sins? And I looked at her and said, yes. Now, I'm not a Christian practitioner. And I don't go around going, I accept Jesus and you need to too, or we're all going to go to hell. But in that context, that question, it was very easy for me to say, yes, I accept that context. I accept that point of view. And it stopped the conversation right in its tracks so that we could proceed. when I was doing work with the Self-Realization Fellowship, which is, ancient Hindu guru-based practice around Yogananda, and the primary, not mandate, but urging in their practice is there is nothing more supreme than a daily communion with God. I remember that one of the nuns said to me, because we were talking about how to take this practice out to a larger group of people. One of the nuns said to me, "You cannot take God out of this." Right? So God is in, and pictures of Yogananda are around. And I went and read Autobiography of a Yogi. And I'll tell you, a very strange thing happened by opening that circle of affiliation is, I was able to lead a workshop of 40 monks and nuns sequestered up at Mother Center here on Mount Washington in LA, and really connect and really work with them. And to do that, I checked in with Yogananda daily. In my Zen meditation, I would meditate and I would also check in with Yogananda. And when I was teaching those people, I would check in with Yogananda and go, am I getting this right? Not my practice. We talked a lot in the founding of Prajna Heart Zen Center about a vision of a world of no separation. No big surprise in that. Zen Buddhism, right? And we've talked about reconciliation. But it really comes down to that other, and that looking over your shoulder in fear at the other, and deepening our practice and our realization to the point that we realize that there isn't an other, that this is all one big mass of humanity, and we are in it together, men and women, gay, straight, queer, non-gender conforming, of all races, dead, living, and future. We have to get to that place as a context, or we are going to go down this rat hole that it looks like we're going down day by day with no possibility of forward advancement. Why don't they understand me? How come they are so stupid and don't get the truth? How can that be, those people? Now, you know that if you're a New York Times reader, liberal, abortion rights advocate, queer advocate, why don't they understand? And yet, what do you think is happening on the other side of that conversation? There's a huge, why don't they understand, coming right back at, well, I'll just say it, us. Just identifying me, right? If your context is that context, you want to be understood, you want to be heard. And it has all kinds of languaging around it, and I'm not taking a position, but why don't they understand the sanctity of life? And we stand there yelling, why don't you understand the sanctity of life, from two equally passionate positions, and we just yell at each other? So where is progress? How is progress ever possible? Sometimes in teaching difficult conversations in the business context, we talk about non-attachment to outcome. Can you go into a conversation not attached to a specific outcome? And people are like, how is that possible? I have things to accomplish. I have a point of view. They need to understand. And one thing I like to do, and this is a thought experiment you can always play with yourself, is just turn it around. What if I walk into the room and the other person is so entrenched in their point of view and so attached to the only outcome they will accept? What happens then? Well, why even walk into the room? Why bother? So if we're not willing to open up and be the big ones with the big mind and the big heart and the big arms and the big circle of affiliation to start having some of these conversations, how are they going to happen at all? How are they going to happen at all? Empathy is, at its finest, creating a condition in which the other person knows that they are understood. That's empathy, not sympathy, not pity. Making sure that the other person knows that they are understood. In the starting point. So anyway, it puts this sixth thing from the day of reflection about in the midst of awakening, beautiful language here, in the midst of awakening, okay? Why is it said that way? Because I am in the midst of my awakening. I am the awakened one. I am big mind. In the midst of awakening, embodying the precept of not talking about others' errors and faults, I, with kindness for the duration of one day, will unconditionally accept what each moment has to offer. I will acknowledge responsibility for everything in my life. How cool is that? And how difficult? You know? So we went through these at the beginning of the day, and I asked you to just see what resonated with you, because it's really a wonderful practice just to take one of these on and go, for one day, can I transform anger into wisdom? For one day, can I practice sobriety, and not just sobriety of chemical or alcoholic intoxicants, but intoxicants of attachment? Can I practice sobriety and cultivate a mind that sees clearly for one day? I think this day of reflection, you could commit a whole practice to this. Sometimes it's like, how do I manifest these teachings? It's like all these koans and all these sutras and all this and all this oneness and all this absolute and all this relative. Pretty damn fine cheat sheet. Pick one. Manifest the Buddha.